Good evening. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's talk. I'm just up here to take care of a few items of business. My name is Jim Dodge. I'm director of the Johnson Center for Environmental Innovation here, which center is one of the co-sponsors of this talk, but I'd also would like to acknowledge the Environmental Studies program, the Economics and Management program, and the Gustavus Lecture Series for supporting tonight's talk. Thank you to all of them for that support. The other two minor items of business is we're as a society, we're getting pretty good at this, but the cell phones and pagers off kind of rule. And for those of you coming from off campus, there are restrooms on this floor, out the door and to the right. It's kind of hidden behind there, but they are there. In keeping with what I see as a Gustavus tradition, although I don't think we have elevated it to that level, we turn to our students for introductions. And I would like to invite Andrew Lewis, a economics management and environmental studies major at Gustavus, who has prepared an introduction for our speakers. So, thank you, Andrew.
Our speakers tonight are prominent and controversial voices in the U.S. policy climate debate. They were among Time Magazine's Heroes of the Environment in 2008. Their 2004 essay, The Death of Environmentalism, challenged the tactics of the modern environmentalist movement. Authors of the 2007 book Breakthrough and founders of the Breakthrough Institute, ladies and gentlemen, please help me in welcoming Michael Shellenberger and Ted Nordhaus.
Well, thanks for having us. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I want to especially thank Jim for bringing us out all the way from California. This is a part of the world that I spent a little time in a long time ago, but it's been a long time since I've been here, so it's really nice to be back.
Sorry, the weather wasn't nice again.
I'm gonna bat in the lead-off slot here, and then I'll hand things off to Michael about halfway through our presentation. The topic of our talk today is Beyond Environmentalism, Towards a New Ecological Politics. Let me start by giving you a little bit more background on Michael and I, who we are, and what we do. So the two of us are lifelong environmentalists. We both grew up in the environmental movement. Between the two of us, probably spent about 25 years working as staff and consultants to virtually every major national environmental group in the country between the two of us. In 2008, Time Magazine named us Heroes of the Environment. We really made our name criticizing doom and gloom environmentalism and really apocalyptic environmentalism, as well as the sort of dominant policy framework for dealing with climate change in an essay that we wrote and self-published called The Death of Environmentalism in 2004. We followed up on that with a book-length expansion of the argument in 2007 called Breakthrough, which Wired magazine described as possibly the most important thing to happen to environmentalism since Silent Spring. We'll see. The book's still out on that, but we hope those of you who've read the book, it lives up to that billing. And we now run the Breakthrough Institute, which the two of us co-founded in 2004. We have a 10-person staff that does research and analysis, focusing on energy and climate issues, and funded by a number of major environmental and liberal philanthropies. And our focus in recent years and are really our central sort of argument on what we need to do to address our twin energy and climate challenges, is that we have to make clean energy technologies radically cheaper so that they can actually replace fossil fuels on the scale that would be necessary to actually address climate change. We also published not long ago among the first reports that looked at the US in comparison to Asian clean tech innovation and manufacturing. So we've long made the case that dealing with climate change and advancing clean energy would be critical to our future economic competitiveness and was a major economic challenge as well as environmental challenge facing the United States. So let's start with sort of why we came to prominence, which was that we sort of very prominently criticized the national environmental movement, particularly around its failures to address global warming. And those failures since 2004, when we wrote our first public criticism of the environmental movement, have only continued. Cap and trade failed for the fourth time last year, as many of you know, in less than 10 years. And that was even though, despite what many environmentalists have claimed, that they were massively outspent and outgunned by the fossil fuel industry. In fact, cap and trade supporters, which included many of the most powerful energy and utility companies in the country, actually appear to have substantially outspent opponents of that legislation. Around the same time that cap and trade was failing, it also became clear that the international effort to address climate change through a treaty to cap global emissions had failed as well. We saw that in Copenhagen in December of 2009, where the nations of the world failed to renew the Kyoto Accord, and that was really made even clearer in Cancun, where it was very clear that the world was moving on to a different framework for dealing with global climate emissions. I'm going to skip a couple of slides here just because we've got a lot to cover. So what's behind all of this? Well, the first thing to understand is that in recent years, especially after the movie An Inconvenient Truth, there was a lot of elite intention and concern paid to climate change. But public attitudes more generally didn't change very much. And in fact, in recent years, we've seen a pretty significant turn on the part of the American public away from environmental concerns. So this is Gallup, the Gallup poll, which has tracked people's sort of view about whether it was more important to protect the environment or promote economic development for over 20 years, starting back in 1985. And we see that, particularly since the recession in 2008, just a profound decline in the number of Americans saying that economic development was more important than protecting the environment. In fact, in those years, for the first time in many years, we saw more people saying that it was more important to grow the economy than to protect the environment. So actually sort of losing ground, environmental movement losing ground with the American public. So why is this? What went wrong? Well, let's start with the sort of basic story that the modern environmental movement has mostly been telling in one form or another for many years now. And it's an old story. It's a story of the sin of hubris and our fall from nature and the end of the world. So this story is one that you're all probably familiar with. It starts in the garden where Adam and Eve lived in harmony with nature. And we see this very same story repeated in a new form at the very beginnings of the birth of the modern environmental movement. This is Rachel Carson in her landmark book, Silent Spring, which is widely credited with birthing the modern environmental movement. And she opens that book with a sort of tale of nature before human pollutants destroyed it, writing that all life seemed to live in harmony with its surroundings. And then we start using pesticides and the birds all start to die and stop singing. And this is a story, again, that has much earlier antecedents, even before the Bible. We see this is Icarus, who flew too close to the sun and crashed to the earth. Again, a story of hubris, and really the hubris of youth flying too high. This is Prometheus, who steals fire from the gods, and his fate is to have his liver eaten out every day for the rest of eternity. I believe it's an eagle that eats his liver every day. Adam and Eve, you'll recall, are cast out of the garden for eating from the tree of knowledge. And the result of this kind of hubris, of humans attempting to live as gods, is apocalypse. 4 horsemen there. And again, we see these stories sort of recycled as modern environmentalism starts to come into view in the late 60s and early 70s. So one of the most, after the publication of Silent Spring, one of the most sort of influential books in the early years of the modern environmental movement was Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, and it really kind of picks up on this idea that we've sort of fallen out of harmony with nature and builds on it around the idea that there is not enough room for all of us on the planet. And this is Ehrlich writing in his book about going to India in the 1960s. He writes about people thrusting their hands through the taxi window, begging, people defecating and urinating, people clinging to buses, people herding animals, people, this sense of this teeming humanity that just is overwhelming us and that he needs to get away from. He wonders, would we ever get back to our hotel? All 3 of us were frankly frightened, and that India couldn't possibly feed 200 million more people by 1980. And we see even in Gore's movie and book, An Inconvenient Truth, sort of similar tales of humanity being punished. He writes of Katrina as it was almost like a nature hike through the book of Revelation. The truth about the climate crisis is an inconvenient one that means we are going to have to change the way we live our lives, or implicitly, we will be punished by nature for our sins. This is the narrative that is really identical to the narrative of a depressed person. In our book, we write about Aaron Beck, who is the founder of the modern field of cognitive therapy. And Beck, as a psychologist, does his research working with people who are very, very depressed. And what he finds is that they share 3 core beliefs. The first, my world is bleak. The second, I'm no good. The third, my future is hopeless. And what cognitive therapy does, and what Beck figures out to do, is to actually talk back to these depressing, overgeneralizing narratives and help people actually re-narrate their lives in a different way that allows them to actually change their lives, to take control of their lives, and to live the lives that they want to live. So one of the questions that we've asked for many years now and argued is that there is a different story that we can tell about humanity and about the ecological challenges that we're faced with today. And just like the old story, it starts with an argument about human nature. And that argument goes that there is not a single human nature. There are many human natures. We all have many human natures within us. We have violent and hostile and warlike natures. We have peaceful and loving natures. These are bonobo here, the prior picture being chimpanzees, both close primate ancestors and relatives of human beings. We make the case that technology does not disenchant the world. It's not profane. In fact, it's sacred. We evolved together with our technologies. This is a picture of a human hand next to an earlier primate hand. And look at how different the fingers are. The primate with much longer fingers. And ape's fingers are long and good for hanging from branches, while the human hand right has a long, strong thumb that makes the hand more versatile. And this is from research that actually has concluded that literally our hands evolved to allow us to better use tools. So tool use and tool making, literally at the very sort of beginnings of our evolution into Homo sapiens is happening, is necessary. We could not have evolved as we did without our tools. So our technologies are sacred. And we've not fallen from nature, we've risen. The entirety of the human experience has not been a fall from harmony, but a rise from radical insecurity. So here we love this cartoon. There's two cavemen, and one saying to the other, something's just not right. Our air is clean, our water is pure, we all get plenty of exercise, everything we eat is organic and free range, and yet nobody lives past 30. So the story of human evolution and human development is really a story of overcoming, of liberating ourselves from poverty, peonage, from being at the mercy of the natural world, and establishing increasing amounts of control over our environment and the world around us. And that's a good thing. As we'll see, it has come with new problems that we need to continue to deal with and to manage and to evolve. And we need to continue to evolve new technologies and new social technologies as well to deal with these issues. But that basic process is a salutary one, not a negative one. Now, this is a picture of Norman Borlaug. He's generally acknowledged as the father of the Green Revolution. He was an agronomist and an advocate for new agricultural technologies, and he was the nemesis of the population bombers. They believed that these efforts to improve agricultural yields couldn't possibly succeed and would only end badly. Borlaug is widely acknowledged to have saved hundreds of millions of lives from famine and starvation. He won the Nobel Prize in 1970. And while we often sort of in stories like this focus on the man, the single, brilliant, driven visionary, it wasn't just one man. It was really a story of governments and NGOs and agribusinesses and philanthropists working together over many decades to improve agricultural practices, agricultural technologies, and improve agricultural yields so we could feed a growing population. And they succeeded. The sort of what we would call the Malthusian premise, which is we see articulated by Paul Ehrlich, is really results from a failure of imagination. That's what lies behind the idea that there are just these hard natural limits to how many people the planet can support. And what they can't imagine is what they were unable to imagine was that we would see these just extraordinary increases in agricultural yields. Here we see wheat yields in Mexico, India, and Pakistan, the increase in yields of wheat from 1950 through 2000. And again, it's technology that's really sort of changing the game here. Here again, a similar chart, even more radical with corn yields. Hydrogenetics and biotechnology have driven a 5-fold increase in average US corn yields since 1940. This is what Paul Ehrlich and the other population bombers just were unable to anticipate or imagine. This picture of Borlaug working in a field with Mexican laborers and agronomists in 1950. So what's going on here? Here we have this remarkable story of sort of technology sort of creating all sorts of remarkable new possibilities for human societies and for a planet with now 7 billion of us. And yet we continue to hear these sort of narratives of this fall, of this idea that science and technology are not the answer, they're actually the problem. And really what happens is a cultural turn against modernization, science and technology that starts in the 1960s. We even see it in our science fiction. So in the 50s or in the 60s, you have Star Trek. Here, the Federation is a benign interplanetary government that is highly advanced and technological and is helping civilizations continue to develop and modernize. Now, by 1970, we have a very different story, Star Wars. Here, the kind of global federation is evil. It's an empire, technologically advanced empire attempting to sort of subjugate other planetary civilizations. And the resistance, the heroes, are a monarchical and mystical group that lives close to nature. You have the Ewoks and Obi-Wan Kenobi and the Jedi Knights fighting the evil technological empire. So clearly, if you just look at Star Trek, the shift from Star Trek to Star Wars, something is going on in the culture. And this is around the same time. You have Ehrlich saying the planet can't support enough of us. You famously have the Club of Rome predicting just a global resource collapse. And you have books like Small is Beautiful, which sold more than 700,000 copies in 1969, I think, 1970, I'm not quite sure of the year, suggesting that really the answer was to sort of downscale our expectations, live sort of in smaller, fewer people, smaller communities, more decentralized energy and economic system. And we see similar transformation in environmental politics. The Sierra Club and the New Left were actually, believe it or not, in favor of nuclear power as late as the early 60s. By the end of the 1960s, they both rejected, both the New Left and the Sierra Club had rejected nuclear power. Was seen as sort of a part of the kind of Cold war machine. And this is just in stark contrast to even just a few years before. This is from the famous Port Huron statement, the sort of founding document of Students for a Democratic Society. Tom Hayden famously was the primary author. He writes, "Our monster cities, based historically on the need for mass labor, might now be humanized broken into smaller communities powered by nuclear energy arranged according to community decision. So you see a big shift in views on nuclear energy, but even as early as the early 60s, you see this sort of idea that we need, that the sort of these big centralized societies are sort of dehumanizing, and we need to live in smaller communities that are completely self-sustaining. Some years later, by the mid-70s, you have Amory Lovins, the father of what is now known as the soft energy path. And Lovins makes the case against nuclear power by arguing that rather than building more nuclear power plants, we can use radically less energy in America and power our energy needs that we have with solar power and other renewables. And he writes, and again, sort of picking up on this idea that we see earlier of sort of this preference for decentralization, this idea of that small is beautiful. If nuclear power were clean, safe, economic, is short of ample fuel, and socially benign per se, it would still be unattractive because of the political implications of the kind of energy economy it would lock us into. So again, there's sort of, this is about something other than the technology itself. It's really an argument about what kind of society we should be living in, and it's an argument against really sort of modernization and the shape that the modern world itself has taken. So, and Lovins and his colleagues were actually quite successful. The anti-nuclear movement succeeded in preventing nuclear plants in the US and Europe. The last plants in the US and Europe were permitted in the late 70s. They obviously get a big hand from accidents at 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl. Our economy, as Lovins predicted, became much more energy efficient. But a funny thing happened that Lovins didn't anticipate, which is that we still used a lot more energy. US energy consumption of electricity grew by 66% between 1984 and 2000. Lovins, looking at energy efficiency trends, had predicted that it would be flat. So you see here the graph of declining energy efficiency or energy intensity with rising energy use. So the two things are happening at the same time. And the result, of course, because of this rising energy use, because we weren't going to build nuclear plants, and because of this sort of growing faith in renewables, was that we went on a coal building boom. And we built enormous numbers of new coal-fired power plants in the United States and all over the world in the 1980s and 1990s, and continue to do so, while renewables have struggled to capture a significant share of energy markets. And here you see fossil energy use in the US from 1973 to 2004. So this is not the picture of the soft energy path. This is a hard energy path, growing energy use and continued heavy reliance on fossil energy. So this is, unfortunately, the kind of legacy that traditional environmentalism has bequeathed us. And I'm going to hand things over to Michael, who's going to talk about sort of where things go from here and how we can change that path. So thank you all.
Thanks everybody for showing up tonight, and I also want to thank Jim and the Center for inviting us out. In a little bit, we'll talk about why we think we love the name of the Center for Environmental Innovation, where the focus is on change rather than on stasis or some return to harmony, which will become obviously very important as we think about what the world needs going forward. let's start with some very basic baselines of where the world is headed. The world is going to use a lot more energy. Between now and the middle part of the century, global energy consumption will double, it might triple. By the end of the century, it'll triple, roughly quadruple. This is largely due to the fact that the 6 billion people or the 5 billion people on Earth who are still relatively poor are going to start to live lives much more like the lives that people live in Europe or the United States. And as they become richer, they're going to use a lot more energy. And you can see here, this expansion of energy goes along with the expansion of wealth. And of course, a big shift will occur. Today, you can see here that the developing world, most of the world controls about a third of global wealth, global GDP. But by the end of the century, that's going to change. And what we now call the developed world will control less than a quarter of global wealth. Of course, the developing world won't be the developing world anymore, it'll be the developed world by the end of the century. And what we want to say here is that rising energy consumption is overwhelmingly a positive thing. There are negative unintended consequences which we have to deal with, but let's just start with the basics. Rising energy consumption is strongly correlated with longer lifespans, with better health, less disease, greater freedom. Energy consumption, for the most part, is a very positive thing in a world where a lot of kids have to spend their day walking to get water or to fetch firewood for their families to cook. The number of people, and things are mostly getting better in this sense, the number of people living on $2 a day has declined from 4 billion in 1982 to 2 billion today. And in China in particular, an amazing, really miraculous story, 500 million Chinese have been lifted out of dire, back-breaking, rural agrarian poverty in less than 20 years to become China's new urban proletariat. Still hard living in those Chinese factories, but overwhelmingly better life than they had on the countryside. And here's the rub of it. Coal remains the cheapest source of energy everywhere in the world almost. And it is the source of energy that is overwhelmingly going to be used to power global development. So one question that we often get is, well, that sounds like maybe we can all just do it with a little less. Don't we all have enough already here in the United States? So we ran some numbers here. We said, what if everybody on Earth made $15,000 a year? In the United States right now, the per capita, the family income of a family of 4 is about $92,000 a year. But what if everybody came down to $15,000 a year per capita? That's the number that some folks have suggested is all we need to live on to be happy. That research has actually been debunked, but let's run with it for the source of this exercise. You can see here population today, 6.9 billion going to 8.3 in 2030 to about 9 billion in 2050. Per capita GDP, again, we're going to hold it flat at 15,000, and you see still a huge increase in global GDP, even if we freeze everybody's annual salary at $15,000. You would still need, we find, if you care to reduce global warming emissions by the amount that the United Nations suggests that we should, you would still need to cut carbon dioxide from 78 to 22 billion tons. So without going into all of these sub-details here, you can see that global CO2 emissions by 2030 are still going to be here at 78 billion tons and are going to need to be at 22 billion tons. So clearly, we're not going to get to where we need to go by all of us in the rich world doing with a little bit less. That approach simply isn't going to do it. So one question is the problem, as traditional environmentalists have suggested, that we have too much technology, too much wealth, too much consumption, or is it really the opposite, that in fact we don't have enough technology, that our technologies are too crude, too primitive, and not advanced enough? We're going to argue for the latter. And what we'll do is we'll present to you just technologically what you would need to do to achieve what the United Nations recommends you need to do to quote unquote stabilize climate emissions at 450 parts per million of carbon dioxide between now and 2050. They say you would need to do one of the following. You would need to build 5 wind farms the size of Cape Wind, which hasn't been built yet because of such strong local opposition. They've been trying to build it for 10 years. You need to build 5 of those a day. And again, under normal circumstances here, it takes about a decade to build one of them. You would need to build 5 Mojave solar electric generation systems per day. These are the largest solar farms in the world. It takes many years to get those permitted and built. You would need to have build one full-size coal plant or natural gas plant that then captures the CO2 underground. You have to do that every day. You would have to manufacture and install 1 million solar panels every day. Or you would need to build one large 5 gigawatt nuclear power plant every 5 days. Also impossible to build a nuclear plant in 5 days. It currently takes about 10 years to do any of the above. And the bottom line is that you have to have some pretty serious advances in these technologies if you want to hope to scale up and replace our fossil energy economy as quickly as many of us would like. Now there's one important historical fact. There are only 2 countries in the world that have rapidly moved to clean energy, and those were France and Sweden. And they did so largely through the direct deployment of nuclear power. In other words, all the focus on solar panels and wind and conservation, there are only 2 countries in the world that have reduced their emissions at the rate that the United Nations says that we must if we're to avoid significant increases in temperature that cause disruption. And they did it mostly through nuclear power. Here's France. You can see this is a measure of what we call carbon intensity. You can see a measure of how much CO2 per unit of energy dropping radically in the 70s there. Mostly, really in direct response to the 1973 oil crisis and then the 1979 oil crisis. Interestingly enough, it was not done for environmental reasons and not for global warming reasons, but for national security reasons. Sweden, similar story with the addition of a lot of hydroelectric dams, but also in the same period of time in the 70s, you can see really starts in the 60s, but really starts to happen in earnest in response to the 1970s oil price shocks. So one obvious question that a lot of us that were born and raised in the anti-nuclear movement have is, isn't nuclear power just too dangerous? Isn't it something that we really shouldn't be messing around with, especially after what's happened in Japan? Well, let's take a look at the safety record. The first is that nobody died at 3 Mile Island. In retrospect, it looks like a far less serious accident, for example, than the one at Fukushima. Meanwhile, 69 people have died just oil drilling just in the Gulf and just since 2001. The only serious accident was at Chernobyl. This is a reactor that was built in a Stalinist, in the Soviet Union, Stalinist closed society. It had no containment dome, which if you know anything about nuclear power plants at all, that's a pretty basic piece of equipment that you want around your hot core. They didn't have that. But surprisingly, the United Nations sent out its experts, that 100 scientists look at it. So far to date, they can count 60 people that have died because of Chernobyl. It may sound like a lot of people, but consider that just coal mining every year kills between 2,000 to 5,000 people. And of course, we still have the French nuclear program up and running, which is, we think, arguably one of humankind's most impressive technological achievements, run with a kind of culinary precision. And a lot of people want to know, well, what about the waste? So let's first put the waste in some context. Because of the density of nuclear power, half a decade's worth of America's waste can fit into a 3 football field sized site. This is a dry cask storage area, 1 barrel high. Meanwhile, France eliminates 95% of its most radioactive waste through reprocessing. So one thing to point out is this is a small amount of waste, pretty easily contained. And let's put it in some context here. 2 million people die every year from air pollution, according to the World Health Organization. That's 3 times more that die from air pollution than from car accidents. So you're thinking about 2 million people dying every year from air pollution, in contrast to about 60 that have died from Chernobyl in total. And you have coal-fired power plants. which produce hundreds of millions of tons of toxic and hazardous coal ash and slurry every year. Much of it indeed is actually radioactive. This doesn't even count the mountains that are destroyed and removed in places like Appalachia and the waste dumped back into the streams. See it here? And all the devastation that's caused by oil drilling. So while nuclear waste can be contained in a small area, carbon waste results in global warming with massively uncertain and potentially catastrophic impacts. But we hasten to point out that even if you don't believe that global warming is happening, or if you think that global warming won't be a big deal, nuclear power in comparison to other energy sources is still far safer, with far less waste and far less unintended consequences. Here's what a NASA scientist, one of the world's leading climate experts, James Hansen, has to say. He says, "One of the greatest dangers the world faces is the possibility that a vocal minority of anti-nuclear activists could prevent a phase-out of coal emissions." So let's just sum up a bit of this vision here. And again, the point that we want to make is let's put the technology at the center of our politics. We have conversations with people with climate skeptics, people who don't think that global warming is either happening or a problem or caused by humans. But the one thing we find we can agree on is that we all believe we should move to cleaner sources of energy. You're hard-pressed to find anybody out there who says, no, I'd really rather stick with coal given all the consequences. If there's a cheaper, better, safer alternative, you find people across the political spectrum who want it. More broadly speaking, you can see this agenda has got to include making clean energy, and that includes nuclear power, much cheaper so that it can replace fossil energy over the next century. We also need to increase agricultural yields on big farms to reduce pressure on forests. Much of the deforestation happening in the Amazon right now is in the southern part of the Amazon, and it's happening by converting forests into soy plantations or into cattle ranching operations. So if you have some way to increase agricultural yields in those places, it will take the pressure off of those natural areas that you want to protect. More people living in cities is also better for the environment, has less impact, and allows more green space. And all of this is, of course, going to require much more and not less technological innovation. Here you can see that trade-off between agricultural field here, probably a soy plantation, and the rainforest. So what is that going to require in terms of policies and politics? The focus has got to be squarely on innovation. We think that all of the clean energy technologies today need to be improved. That includes nuclear, solar, batteries, biofuels, electric cars. We need to increase the amount of money we spend on research and development. We need to put somewhere between 30 and 40 hubs at university research centers so that graduate students, postgraduate students, university professors, venture capitalists, utilities, energy companies can all be working together to achieve both incremental and breakthrough innovation. We think that the way that we subsidize energy right now is completely backwards. We are subsidizing technologies that already exist. We're subsidizing people to make more of the old technologies rather than doing what the Defense Department does, which is that it purchases advanced technologies that are really on the cutting edge. This is what we did on microchips. The Defense Department did this on jet airplane turbines, which also become natural gas turbines, and you're constantly pushing innovation forward. And President Obama, after several years, has finally sort of got this. In his State of the Union a couple months ago in January, said instead of subsidizing yesterday's energy, let's invest in tomorrow's. The role for government here is pretty straightforward. Governments have always provided the new platforms for new technologies. That goes for the railroads, the telegraphs, sewage systems, potable water, the interstate highway system, the electrical grid, the internet. You see the role of military procurement has been critical to America's, not only its military superiority, but also our economic development. The radios, microchips, jet turbines, GPS, lasers, solar panels, nuclear reactors, all of these things came from direct military style or military procurement. Here you see Hewlett and Packard working in their laboratory, and of course the famed microchip starts out as $1,000 a chip. In the late 50s, in less than 10 years, it's cost less than $20 a chip. or the Defense Department had bought so many of them and driven down the price so much. These are the actual inventors of the internet. Here they are. Nobody knows their name, but these are the gentlemen who worked at DARPA to invent a communication system that could survive a nuclear war, which eventually then became commercialized. And we see the success of American investments in R&D all over the place. You see them in our land grant colleges, which were part of Lincoln's vision of the homesteading and the railroads. You see them in the National Institutes of Health. We've sort of forgotten about the role that government plays here in advancing technology and economic growth, but it's been critical for the last 200 years. And then you see advanced demonstrations. Sometimes, again, you need the government to go ahead and build some of the first of these big wind turbines like the Danish government did in the 1990s, or start to buy some of the initial solar panels like the Japanese and the Germans have done. And this is a report that we came out with late last year, gave it to, made sure people in the White House saw it. It's called Where Good Technologies Come From. It really looks at each of these technologies. Every technology in your iPhone, every major technology in your iPhone came from Defense Department funding. We all want to give the credit to Steve Jobs and Apple, and they're certainly geniuses, but those basic technologies wouldn't exist had the Defense Department not made those investments. And this is the right paradigm, and you see the president finally coming to this in January. Throughout our history, our government has provided cutting-edge scientists and inventors with the support that they need. That's what planted the seeds for the internet. That's what helped make possible things like computer chips and GPS. Just think of all the good jobs from manufacturing to retail that have come from these breakthroughs. So a lot of folks go, your vision, you guys want to spend $30 billion a year on energy. That's about what we spend on health, on R&D for health, the National Institute of Health. That's not going to happen right away. And we say, that's right. This is going to be a long-term effort. It's not going to happen overnight. I think it's important for us to recognize that this kind of apocalypse talk, this doom and gloom, this return to nature, all of that really poisoned the well. It really divided the country in a way that has made it so that even clean energy is now viewed as politicized and as polarized. A lot of conservatives and swing voters just 10 years ago who saw wind and solar as good technologies to move to now view them as liberal. And so it's going to take some work to get over that. But we think that the fight over energy innovation is the right one to have. Again, we don't have to agree on climate change to agree that we need energy innovation. It's technology where we come together, not science. And we think it's politically difficult for anybody to go out and attack these investments in energy over the long term. And you see the public is already with us. If you ask, would you be willing or not willing to pay higher taxes on gasoline and other fuels if the money was used for research in renewable sources like solar and wind, you get about 64% of the total and of independents supporting that agenda. Thank you very much. I think we're going to sit here and do some questions and answers if people want to ask questions or argue or make a statement. Whatever, we're welcome to that. And Jim will play it over. Should I move this back?
There we go. Well, we are welcome to entertain questions here. Just raise your hand. I can try to get a mic to you as quickly as possible. And I think, as you can see from the talk, the topics are wide open for environmental. Okay, got one going here.
A couple things that you left out of your figures. talk about conservation. The more we conserve, the more energy we use. Is that going to always be true, or should we just give up conservation, or is that going to be part of the solution? And secondly, I didn't see anything in your figures that built in the cost of climate change. You didn't. It wasn't there. Maybe it was. I don't know. Anybody?
Is this working?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think good questions. A couple things on the question of energy conservation. I think our view is that that relationship between declining energy intensity and rising energy use is not; those things are not unrelated. That energy efficiency is best understood, at least sort of what's called below cost energy efficiency that sort of pays back more than it costs, is just another word for energy productivity. And we actually have a pretty good understanding, in economics of what happens when we improve the productivity of what's called a factor input, which is that we use more of it because the implicit price of it declines. There's actually a pretty extensive literature now on the relationship between energy efficiency and energy use, that as we use energy more efficiently, we effectively reduce its price, and we find all sorts of new ways to use it. And that, putting sort of environmental concerns aside, is a good thing. Rising energy productivity has arguably been just an absolutely critical driver of just rising prosperity all over the world. Arguably, the last 200 years at least of economic development has largely been the story of substituting energy capital for labor, which is why virtually none of us work in agriculture today, or even in manufacturing, but mostly sort of work in kind of more of a higher value-added, sort of more rewarding field. It's why so many of you are here and not working on the family farm. So that's the answer, I think, to the first question. On the second question, the cost of climate change. Pick your social discount rate, pick your, which is sort of basically how much we should discount money in the future. Pick your climate damage exponent. Pick your climate science, and I'll tell you how much it costs. And when you look at these various models for sort of how much we should be paying today to avoid climate change in the future, they are, pretty much decide the outcome you want, and then pick your variables and your various assumptions to get to show that that's the proper outcome. So if you don't want to spend a lot of money, pick a high social discount rate. If you want to, if you think we should spend a lot of money, pick a low social discount rate, and you can justify any policy you want. And I think that's not to dismiss the issue of cost. I think pretty clearly we're going to have climate change. I think pretty clearly there are going to be a lot of costs. And I think pretty clearly there's a strong case for spending money today to at least try to mitigate or avoid some of those impacts. But that is not going to be driven by any kind of hard or definitive sort of model or estimate of what the real costs are going to be. It's largely going to be driven by a question of what political economies around the world are willing to spend today. And I think our view, at least, is that sort of these endless arguments about how much global warming is going to cost us, at the end of this century, are probably not a particularly effective way to kind of motivate political economies around the world to take action, and that, as Michael noted in his part of the presentation, probably finding more short-term and more immediate benefits to motivate sort of making the kinds of investments that we need to make in new technology and in reducing emissions is going to be a lot more effective way to kind of get where we need to go than sort of trying to kind of just sort of reach sort of what are somewhat arbitrary, in our view, conclusions about how much global warming is going to cost us in the long term.
A question for Michael, if you would please, over here. Considering that transportation takes up roughly a third of our total output of energy, could you address Shai Agassi's idea of a better place in the electric car in his model of Denmark, as well as Israel, and possibly the state of Hawaii? How does that fit into your vision?
Well, I mean, I think there's things about it that we like, and there's things about it that we're skeptical of. You want to too loud? No. No? I mean, generally, we think that there are good national reasons to move away from oil or reduce our dependence on oil. Good national security reasons, good economic security reasons, and so generally we support the process of moving to electrify transportation, ideally with the electricity coming from low carbon power sources. I think increasingly, though, we're skeptical that that electrification process is going to work all at once, all of a sudden, with all of us, buying electric cars and refueling, so to speak, recharging at power stations, which is the better place model. I think that could actually work in relatively small, places like Hawaii and places like Israel. I think it could work quite well there. I think our view is that you're going to continue to, that cars are already getting more and more electrified from the hybrids, moving down the drivetrain, and that will probably happen a bit more gradually in that sense, because I think you're going to have less of those upfront infrastructure problems and challenges of refueling and recharging. But I think I'd also, as part of any innovation strategy, I think we'd support some sort of investment in those kinds of prospects, because I think even when things don't quite work out on those particular paths, there are innovation is a strange animal. It doesn't move in a single direction. So I think we'd also, I think we're excited to see the energy in that space, even if we're a little skeptical that it's going to happen exactly as Shai Agassi wants it to happen.
I could also see, if we continue to go to an electric model, more coal being burned, thus
Yeah. I mean, we did have a paper, I think we had a paper kind of last summer about electrification by one of our fellows. We definitely focus more on what we call primary power, which is really focused on the electricity sector, in part because of that problem of, if you move to electric vehicles now, it almost certainly increase demand for coal, since that's the bulk of our electricity generation and bulk of coal generation.
In your essay, The Long Death of Environmentalism, your ninth thesis is that we need to have more, you say that this will require technological innovation on a vast scale, talking about clean energy technology. And what happens if the innovation that we're looking for does not manifest itself or is not as clean as we could hope? What solution can we look to then?
I mean, I think our view, and I think we say it elsewhere, we said it elsewhere in that speech, is that without sort of fairly dramatic improvements in the cost and performance of clean energy technologies, we are not going to significantly decarbonize the global economy anytime soon. It's just not going to happen. You don't have technologies that can scale at the level that they need to scale to drive significant reductions in emissions. And those technologies are too expensive. And that's even the case in wealthy, developed economies such as ours, but it's even more so the case in developing economies, which is where most of the energy use and emissions are going to come from over the next century. I think our view is that in terms of decarbonization, there's really not a plan B here. Plan A is go try to get the technologies that you need as fast as possible. I think in the meantime, we need to sort of redouble our efforts to improve societal resilience globally to climate. And I think it's important to remember that that actually is not the same as attempting to provide societal resilience to climate change. The big problem for most of the world is still just a climate exactly as it is today. The marginal over the next certainly 50 years, not 100 years, the things that will get marginally worse because of climate change are kind of relatively insignificant compared to just the basic vulnerability. So kind of compare, for instance, the loss of life associated with the 2006 tsunami versus the recent tsunami in Japan. About 20,000, maybe 30,000 people ultimately will die from the tsunami. In Japan, about 10 times as many died in the tsunami in 2006 because it struck much poorer economies that were much less prepared for that risk, a risk which is not a climate risk. When we look at this, we need to be, when we think about adaptation, I think we need to be thinking about the larger questions of societal resilience more generally and continuing to try to accelerate that, while at the same time I think we try to accelerate innovation in the key technologies that we need to decarbonize our economies in the long term.
I'd like to follow up with the issue of electricity. I understand that's not the primary energy source, but it is important, and it will be more important that there are electric cars. But that's the technology we move to. So do you have a vision of how we can move toward clean electricity, or is that be the product of some as yet unfound new innovative technology?
I think so just to clarify, our ideal policy would, if we had, control of the Congress, which we don't have, I think we would see a very low carbon price, maybe a carbon tax, or you can have a price on carbon by auctioning pollution allowances, with all of the money returned for investment in innovation. And it would start out low so that you don't have any impact on the economy, so you don't slow economic growth, so you don't raise unemployment, so that you don't raise energy prices. But then have it set to increase gradually over the next 100 years. And that way, two things happen. You get the innovation that you need to have low carbon technologies that can compete with fossil. And you are sending a signal to utility operators and others that if they're going to go buy a 50-year power plant, which is how long a coal plant or a nuclear plant lasts, they're going to be making decisions about what that carbon price will be that many decades in the future. And I think the point that we've made about nuclear is that nuclear is the only low carbon power source that is ready right now to compete with coal on price for the most part. Right now, established nuclear generation in the United States is cheaper than coal generation. We hear from folks that in China, their electricity from nuclear is cheaper than their electricity from coal. The barrier in the United States, of course, has been public fear of nuclear. In China, the barrier has been a skilled workforce of scientists and engineers to build more nuclear plants. They have 25 that they're going to build, but they're going to build a lot more coal. So that's why I think we have so much. I think the challenge, of course, is that even with nuclear, even if you start building all those nuclear power plants now, you still have the kind of hard math that we showed before, which is that if you want to reach any of those levels of climate stabilization, whether it's 350 or 450 or 550, you still have to have pretty radical innovation over the next 50 years, next 100 years. so that you can replace fossil energy rather quickly. Go ahead.
If I could follow up, then I understand, if I understand you correctly, you're saying your vision is a price on carbon, and then everything else will follow.
No, we think that the central issue is direct federal investment in innovation to make clean energy much cheaper, and that the carbon price is, frankly, it's optional. I mean, France and Sweden didn't have a carbon price when they reduced their emissions. We think it'd be nice to have a carbon price, but I think our critique for the last 5 years of the environmental movement has been that they thought that the carbon price was going to do all the work. And the only way the carbon price could have done all the work is if it had been a really high carbon price. And there's just no nation in the world that's going to put a really high price on carbon because it raises the price of energy so much and has such a negative consequence on the economy.
One in the back there, and then one up here.
Well, I guess it's a little follow-up to the one before, and I'm contemplating your answer, but I can't think fast enough to change my question. But I still, we've talked about nuclear and that we're making nuclear plants safe, so that nuclear shouldn't be so concerning to all of us, and very few people have died from nuclear. And then you talked about all the people that have died from coal and all the problems from coal pollution and the mining and the deaths of the miners. Why can't we true up the cost of coal if supposedly we've trued up the cost for nuclear, other than really, I don't think the disposal costs are trued up yet. But why can't we true up the cost for coal? Now you said, well, that would raise the price of energy, which would affect the economy. But still, it's as a matter of, I guess, ethics or something. If we're kind of paying the true cost of nuclear, why can't we pay the true cost of coal? And the reason I ask it is, well, then wouldn't that really help out renewable energy? Because it wouldn't have that cheap bar to try to be, that cheap price. Coal to try to be, the price of coal would be higher, and so that renewable would hopefully even be a lower price than coal if we trued up the price of coal.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think and it's a complicated answer. In theory, of course, we could. Now, I think the reality is that even, I just get back to some of these questions about sort of models and the like, but even if we, if you're trying to kind of find the true cost of, if you're trying to figure out what the real costs of coal are, and then sort of price it accordingly, it's actually not clear that we have a high enough carbon price to drive the wide-scale deployment of renewables. If you look at places where we have deployed significant numbers of renewables, what you find is that the carbon price is, the implicit carbon price is really high. So the feed-in tariff, the solar feed-in tariffs in Germany, for instance, are the equivalent of something like a $500 per ton carbon price. Now, at least if you go and look at the economic models, you'll find very few economic models that suggest a carbon price anywhere approaching that level. And wind's a little bit better, but not a lot, and those prices don't really include the full costs of dealing with storage and transmission and the sort of myriad other costs that we don't really have to deal with today because there's such a, solar and wind and other renewables really make up such a small percentage of our energy mix. But if they ever rose significantly, they'd be a lot larger. Now, nuclear can compete with coal today where we're willing to build it. And the obstacles have not really been I think the actual cost so much as the perceived costs. Very difficult to site, huge, incredibly long process. nuclear are not exactly just sort of getting the price on coal right. It's really just sort of deciding to build nuclear, and where we've done that around the world, with the exception of the United States, it's mostly been led by the public sector. You look at France, you look at Sweden, you look at what's happening in China today, and mostly what's gotten nuclear plants built has been sort of direct state development and deployment of those technologies. I think ultimately our view is that we kind of, energy markets are funny things, and I think that the sort of modern day fetishization of market mechanisms to deal with this kind of problem is unwise, and that ultimately we're going to have to use sort of, we need to look at clean energy as a global public good. And the way that we typically provide public goods is through direct state provision of those goods, whether it's clean water or all sorts of other kinds of infrastructure. Clean energy is an infrastructure that sort of requires some fairly direct state involvement to deploy at the kinds of scales that would be necessary to really move away from fossil fuels.
You mentioned a couple times about the military leading by, and I presume it's leading mostly by purchasing things that were being developed by other fields. And I heard something within the last couple of months that the Secretary of the Navy talking about a huge decrease in use of fossil fuels planned for the Navy within the next, I think, 10 years. It was a relatively short time frame. And I just wonder if you have any comments about what the military, what you see them doing in driving this whole thing, because clearly between the courts and the Congress, we're not getting a lot of public policy leadership. But so it's interesting that the military seems like in an odd way is going to be leading this charge.
Right.
What do you think they're going to be doing?
Well, right now it's limited. I mean, one thing I would say is that it's not just that the military wasn't buying things that were already being made. They were buying things that weren't already being made. They were saying, we need this kind of a piece of machinery, and they would then put out contracts for it. So in other words, and our conservative friends who argue back to us, they say, well, somebody else would have invented the internet, or somebody else would have done microchips. But of course, there's no way to know that. At the time that the military was buying those technologies and contracting with private firms to make those technologies, there was no private sector demand for them. So the Navy stuff is exciting. Obviously, the military spends a lot of money just transporting fuel to the front lines. I think the latest numbers we've heard, it costs all in $400 per gallon of gasoline to get a gallon of gasoline to the front lines. So anything that can get you energy-dense liquid fuels to the front lines is a very valuable thing for the U.S. military. I think we're a little cynical about in 10 years we'll have this. In 10 years we'll have, and when we first started this 8 years ago, we had a view of we need a 10-year push. And I think it's just much more acknowledging that you don't know how fast innovation happens. If people kind of go, well, when are you going to get clean energy cheaper than fossil energy? Or when are you going to get your breakthroughs? I mean, we don't know. I mean, when are we going to get a cure for cancer? We still fund cancer research, even though we have been funding cancer research for a few decades, and we don't have a cure. So I think our view is that this has to be a long-term commitment to this public good. What the Navy's doing is exciting. My understanding of what I've heard about the technologies is that they still are a long ways from being able to produce. They can produce the alternatives to jet fuel and gasoline, but it's still quite expensive. So I think we're still a long ways away.
You were talking about how the world needs more technology, not less. And I'm interested in how that applies to agriculture, especially as the world's population continues to rise exponentially. The advances with the Green Revolution, monoculture, things like that, we found make the land unusable over time, or you know what I'm talking about. How can technology help with that?
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot. I mean, I think, we're sort of, the green revolution, like all other technological revolutions, has had unintended consequences. And I think our view is that, the way that sort of humans do technology is that we are sort of constantly adapting to the unintended consequences of our own technologies, and will increasingly be doing so. And agriculture is certainly no different. We still are seeing, increasing yields in all sorts of areas of agricultural production. We're also seeing, problems, resulting from industrial agriculture, from the intensification of agriculture. But our view is that the solution to those problems will be more agricultural technology and better agricultural technology. That we will, I think, have and know of a whole range of practices that help mitigate many of those problems. They're not always widely adopted. Sometimes it costs a little bit more, but I think our view is the trend of this, we may actually see more organic agriculture, but I don't think it's going to be sort of small scale, small farms. I think it's going to be industrial agriculture moving towards less chemical intensive practices. I think at the same time, we're going to continue to see sort of more genetic modification. Arguably the whole history of that agriculture is really the story of genetic modification. We just have some new ways of doing it, but I think we'll see, sort of continuing sort of research to develop new seeds, new fertilizers, and new chemicals to sort of continue to improve agricultural yields. And we're going to need to do that to support, a planet of 9 million people that, frankly, are going to want to eat higher on the food chain as they become wealthier. And I think that's going to be pretty difficult to. I think that genie is not going to be put back in the bottle. So I think it's sort of critical that we kind of continue to accelerate agricultural innovation, both for sort of economic and ecological reasons.
Grab the last question here. We'll wrap it up. One thing you have not mentioned, which is a common topic when we talk about energy policy, is the hypothesis with some evidence to support it that globally we're at the peak of oil supply, that we will not produce more and more. And so given your envisioning a future of innovation, is innovation an energy-intensive activity that requires that abundant supply, or can we do innovation in a declining supply of energy environment?
Well, I think our view is that innovation, that governments around the world and private firms would accelerate the amount of innovation that they're investing in if there were a dwindling supply of fossil energy. I think, well, first of all, I think nobody knows how much oil is left. We keep getting better at finding more of it, deeper and deeper. I mean, Brazil just found a huge oil field off its coast that is, I think, deeper than the drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, by quite a bit. The technologies, we are able to extract more and more oil because of innovation. And now you're seeing all of the shale gas coming online because of technological innovations. I think our view is that peak oil would be nice if it were happening, but we can't count on it to happen, and probably should stop predicting it, as environmentalists have done, as a way to kind of be like, all the more motivation to move off of fossil energy, because I think there's a good chance that we're going to keep, you see it with the tar sands in Canada, you see it using less and less high quality, lower and lower quality fossil energy, and finding ways to to process it for regular uses, and I think that process is going to continue as demand for energy grows. And, questions, trying to predict energy prices is a sucker's game. Energy forecasts are notoriously and famously unreliable, but I think the fact that there is going to be greater global demand for oil supplies and gas supplies, and certainly also for coal, is always one more reason to be pursuing that innovation agenda, even if we never end up running out of this stuff.
Yeah, I would just add one other sort of observation, well, really two. The first is that whether or not we run out of oil is going to get more expensive because it's going to become more expensive to extract, and because demand's going to go up. And oil and actually all fossil fuels are already too expensive for like 2 billion people globally. About 2 billion of us have no access to modern energy, can't afford it, and that's probably only going to get worse. I think the sort of second observation would just be that innovation, the big driver of innovation, I think that sort of energy economists and environmental economists have often conflate price responses to sort of what are really political economic responses. If you look at the graphs of France and Sweden, what you see often gets kind of claimed to be a price response. Energy prices went up and use of oil went down. But really, it was actually a much broader response in those political economies to deal with their vulnerability to price shocks and oil scarcity. And what you saw was massive state investments in nuclear technology and moving away from energy sources that made them economically vulnerable. So I think that whether we're running out of oil or not, I think increasing demand and increasing cost of energy is going to motivate political economies around the world over time to make larger investments in developing and deploying alternatives.
Well, thank you very much. I think there'll be a little time for informal questions afterwards, and I believe we've not gone too late. Their book will be on sale out in the lobby also. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.